A very good morning to one and all present here. In this video class, once again I join you to hold a discussion on the topic All My Sons, written by Arthur Miller. And this is Mrs. Ida Joicey, Assistant Professor, St. Joseph's College of Arts and Science, Cuddalore. So, to start with, let me give you a brief sketch about the author Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller is one of the leading 20th century American dramatists. His classic work is All My Sons. Besides two important notable works to the credit of the writer are The Crucible and Death of a Salesman. Arthur Miller contributed his plays, or he devoted himself as a writer to the cause of the society and politics. He was a writer who had a social concern. He wanted to create a social consciousness in the reader and kindle the moral consciousness and the ethical responsibility which in each individual is supposed to have possessed. This story, All My Sons, revolves around the protagonist Joe Keller. Joe Keller emerges to be the tragic hero of the drama. And as I say, Joe Keller is the tragic hero. This drama is conceived as a social tragedy. Joe Keller is wedded to Kate Keller, and they are blessed with two children, Chris Keller and Larry. Larry, the youngest son, is supposed to have been missing, and the mother is anxiously anticipating the return of Larry. Joe Keller owns a big business firm that manufactures cylinders to be fitted for the airplanes. Joe Keller's business partner is Steve Deaver. So the next set of characters is the family, the Deaver family. Steve Deaver is the head of the family, who is blessed with two children, Ann Deaver and George Deaver. George Deaver is the eldest son and Ann Deaver is the second daughter. We find George Deaver, Ann Deaver, Chris and Larry. They grew up in close neighborhood. They were friends. They were playmates. And Joe Keller shares his business with Steve Deaver. The owner of the firm is Joe Keller. He shares his business with his neighbor and friend, who is Steve Deaver. Joe Keller has built his business over a period of 40 years, and after 40 years of dedicated hard work, he has his own signboard, and he takes much pride in being at the top of everybody else. And this play is also based on the American dream. The American dream after the Great Economic Depression, after the World Wars, made people to be holding a rat race, pursuit for material and money. Materialistic tendencies grew stronger, and every American dreamt to become economically prosperous. So, at the cost of their moral values and human values. So, this bothered Arthur Miller so much that he shaped all his writings towards creating a social consciousness and an ethical sense of duty and responsibility. So, as the play begins, this is cast into 3 acts. The drama is cast into 3 acts. We find in the first act Joe Keller. He is supposed to be a prosperous businessman. The setting of the opening act reveals his prosperity. As I told you, Joe Keller is a typical American who dreams big, who wanted to become materially prosperous, and this only ambition or interest for money made him to sacrifice all other values in life. And two people who are affected by Joe Keller's ambition, it is his own son Larry and his friend Steve Deaver. So as the story progresses, we find Joe Keller, as I mentioned earlier, he owns a big business, a business which manufactures cylinder heads to be fitted for the airplanes. And this business is shared with Steve Deaver. And the company, the firm, is teeming with success forever. And as the play progresses, we find on one particular occasion, that is during the times of the Second World War. So this is a story which was actually published in a newspaper based on a real incident reported in an American newspaper. We find Joe Keller's character is conceived, and the drama, the subject matter of the drama itself has been conceived based on the newspaper report. So it is on the basis of a real life incident, this drama has been structured. Joe Keller once receives, so at the start we find he receives a big government contract where he was supposed to supply cylinder heads to the war planes that are to be used in the Second World War. And on the day of dispatch, Joe Keller is at home and Steve Deaver unfortunately discovers that the cylinders are cracked. And imagine that it is the deadline, it is the last day when Joe Keller is supposed to dispatch the cylinders. And he was shocked to see that cylinders were cracked. He conveys the information over phone to Joe Keller that the cylinders are defective. Joe Keller had only one thing in his mind. He felt if he is not going to keep up the deadline, so meeting out the deadlines is a big challenge for businessmen. If he does not keep up his deadline, he would not again get another contract. So Joe Keller, he wanted to keep up the deadline, so he gives instructions over phone that the cylinders could be welded and they could be dispatched to the army. So as the instructions received from Joe Keller, who is the owner of the firm, Steve Deaver executes it. In a day or two, we find 21 pilots who participated in the Second World War had died. Initially, everybody believed or everybody supposed that the soldiers have died in the war. On investigation further, we find the discovery was done that the death of 21 pilots was caused due to the defective cylinders supplied by Joe Keller's firm. And when the cylinders, the cracked cylinders were welded, when the planes fly at a great speed, the cylinders have bursted, and this had caused the death of 21 pilots. When this case had been taken to the court, Joe Keller simply excuses himself, saying that on that particular day he was on a sick leave and Steve Deaver was held responsible for the act. So Steve Deaver simply acted according to the dictates of Joe Keller, but Joe Keller cunningly plays a trick upon the innocent Steve Deaver and he is exonerated. So Steve Deaver is in a long term of imprisonment, and this made his only daughter Anne to develop a bitter hatred for the father who had been responsible for the death of 21 pilots. And on the other hand, George Deaver completes his course. He becomes a young lawyer and he wishes to try the first case, which is the case of his own father. He wanted to prove that his father is faultless. He meets the father in the jail and he understands that the whole cause for this act, it is not his father, but it is the owner who is Joe Keller. And all these secrets he learns from the imprisoned father, Steve Deaver. And in the second act, which is marked by the arrival of George Deaver, it is an act of revelation. The truth is revealed to Chris Keller. George Keller is against Anne Deaver's presence in the house of the Kellers. He says the very family had been responsible for the shattered condition of the Deaver family and refuses to believe. However, George accuses that even the food of the Keller family is stained with blood because it is the foolish decision or it is the hasty decision of Joe Keller that had cut a toll of 21 lives. And now, when George Deaver leaves in the third act, though we find the case has been solved in favor of Joe Keller, the son Chris Keller grows suspicious about the ways of the father. All the while, Joe Keller had been an ideal hero in the eyes of his son Chris Keller, but after the accusation of George, Chris begins to suspect. He becomes more suspicious about the ways of about the ways of his father, Joe. And he is beginning to question how and why the incident had happened. Joe Keller, even at this point, at the start of the third act. So, when Joe Keller receives the news that George Deaver is going to come home, he was nervous. Joe Keller was nervous because George Deaver comes as a lawyer, and he was more restless and nervous whether the cat will be out of the bag. And as expected, the truth is revealed, or the cat is out of the bag. The real culprit is Joe Keller, and his face mask has been torn into pieces by George Deaver. This makes Chris hold a very hot argument with his father. Joe Keller tries to defend himself, saying, "I did it all for your sake, for the sake of the family." And he says he built his business over 40 years and it is the land of the great big dogs, and you are eaten up when you are idle or when you give in to. So he was not ready even at this point of time to surrender, to reconcile, or even to feel the guilt of his deed. Now, on the other hand, Anne had already received a letter from Larry where he had mentioned that he is going to commit suicide, crash the plane by himself, and atone for the sins of his father. Larry had already known that the father, Joe, had been responsible for the death of 21 pilots who had driven in the P-40 airplanes, and these P-40 airplanes were fitted with faulty, defective cylinders that were supplied by Joe Keller's firm. So, As a way of penance, to atone for the sins of the father, the son has taken up the punishment. Now, only this letter reveals the truth to both Joe Keller and Kate Keller. Joe Keller now realizes his own mistake, and Kate Keller, who all the while forces herself to live under the illusory hope that Larry would return home one fine day, is brought back to the reality. She is able to reconcile with the truth that Larry is no more. Joe Keller, when he learns this, Chris, the other son, who is the hope of the family, already had spoken angrily. He quarrels with the father for his act for which he has no sense of guilt. So he becomes cross with the father and he leaves. He forsakes the family and reads the letter, and she proves that Joe Keller had been the cause for the death of Larry. Kate Keller, the wife, who had been all the while submissive, accuses the husband that he is responsible for the death of one son and for the other son who has forsaken the family, who had got departed. So, we find Joe Keller at this point. He realizes, if Larry is my son, then all the 21 pilots are all my sons. And that's the title, All My Sons. So, at this point, when Joe Keller agrees that the 21 pilots are also his own sons, they are like his own sons, the title of the drama is well justified by Arthur Miller. And the end, what happens? Joe Keller is not able to shut himself. He is not prepared to surrender himself once again by locking up himself in the lonely prison in this small town. Instead, he gets into his room. A gunshot is heard. The firing sound alerts Kate and Anne. Meanwhile, Chris, who has gone out in the stormy weather, comes back home. He steps inside. All the three rush into the room on hearing the firing of the gun. Joe Keller has shot himself dead. So it is once again a suicidal attack of Joe Keller. And he closes his life. So ultimately he has realized the mistake that he has done unto Steve Deaver, Larry and all the 21 pilots. Chris feels guilty that he had killed his father, but the mother Kate says, forget now, live. So she wanted, the typical mother wanted at least the only son who is alive to start a new life with Anne. So ultimately, there is a happy union of Chris Keller and Anne Deaver. Thus the story ends. So the theme of the story is every man has got an ethical responsibility towards his society. Failing to realize this responsibility will lead to tragical consequences. And that is the story. And for further reading, go on to read, continue to read the text. So as literature students, text is treasure. Treasure it and cherish it. All the best. Thank you.